Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that's often hidden in plain sight:
Yeah,
modern slavery.
that's right.
You might think it's a thing of the past,
Right?
but it's actually a reality for millions of people around the world.
Yeah,
And what's even crazier is that sometimes governments themselves can be tangled up in it.
it's true.
Huh.
We tend to picture those like shadowy criminal networks when we think about slavery.
Right.
But this deep dive is going to look at how states, the very entities that are meant to protect people,
Yeah.
can actually play a role in perpetuating that exploitation.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at a report by King's College London in cooperation with the United Nations University that really breaks this down
That's right.
with some real world scenarios that are really going to kind of blow your mind.
Yeah.
When I think of slavery, I think, buying and selling people like the transatlantic slave trade.
Right.
But I'm guessing it's gotten a lot more nuanced than that.
Definitely. The
Yeah.
report uses modern slavery as an umbrella term.
Oh.
It covers a whole spectrum of exploitation. So you're looking at forced labor, human
Yeah.
trafficking,
Oh, wow.
certain forms of child labor. And the numbers are pretty shocking.
Yeah.
In 2016, almost 25 million people were estimated to be trapped in these situations.
25 million. It's
Yeah.
hard to wrap your head around a number that big.
It is.
So this report connects to the UN's Sustainable Development Goal 8.7,
Mm-hmm.
which aims to completely wipe out forced labor and all forms of modern slavery by 2025.
Right.
How does this report fit into that goal?
Well, SDG 8.7 sets that target right. This project
Yeah.
is called State Responsibility for Modern Slavery, Uncovering and Bridging the Gap.
Okay.
And it really looks at how it
Okay.
examines the ways that states themselves can be held accountable
Yeah.
for allowing or even perpetuating these issues.
Yeah.
So that's where the 5 scenarios come in.
Yeah. And I was going to say the 5 scenarios when I was reading this, it was like a light bulb moment for me. Because it's not always like an evil mastermind behind it. Sometimes it's the systems themselves that are messed up.
Yeah, and that first scenario is probably the most jarring one.
Yeah.
It's where modern slavery is actually official state policy.
Wait, so the government itself is running the entire operation?
In some cases, yes.
Wow.
So you have forced labor to meet those production quotas in state-run industries,
Oh, wow.
or you even have governments directly profiting from human trafficking.
That is intense.
It's a shocking reality, but it does happen.
Okay, so scenario 2 kind of shifts the focus a bit.
Yeah.
Instead of the entire state being complicit, we're looking at officials within the government.
Right.
What are some examples of that?
So imagine you have corrupt officials
Yeah.
teaming up with private companies to exploit migrants,
Okay.
smuggling them and forcing them into labor. Or maybe you have officials at a more local level,
Right.
turning a blind eye to forced labor practices. The key here is that even though it might not be official policy, from the top down, these actions can still be attributed to the state under international law.
So even if the government isn't officially condoning it, they're still responsible for it.
That's right.
It's like turning a blind eye makes you guilty too.
Exactly.
And speaking of turning a blind eye, scenario 3 gets into diplomatic immunity,
Yeah.
which I'm fascinated by.
It's an interesting one because it shows how a system that's designed to protect diplomats
Yeah.
can actually be twisted and used for harm.
Yeah.
So we're talking about cases where diplomats are bringing domestic workers from other countries
Okay.
and then subjecting them to just absolutely terrible working conditions.
And I've heard stories about this, like trapped in basically modern day servitude under the guise of diplomatic protection.
It's sadly more common than you'd think.
Yeah.
The report mentions a rise in these cases being brought before courts in places like the UK, the US, and Australia.
Really?
And some systems, like the kafala system in some Middle Eastern countries, make migrant workers incredibly vulnerable because their visa is actually tied to their employer.
So they're basically stuck.
Yeah,
If they speak up, they could get kicked out of the country.
exactly.
Okay, so what about the last 2 scenarios?
So they highlight how even seemingly neutral state actions can end up feeding into exploitation.
Okay.
So scenario 4 is all about state-backed labor brokerage practices.
Labor brokers, those are the middlemen between the workers and the employers.
Right, exactly.
I can see how that could get messy.
Yeah, some brokers charge just these insane recruitment fees,
Okay.
which traps workers in debt bondage. Others might withhold passports or even resort to threats and violence.
Wow.
And you can have states that are directly involved in regulating these firms,
Yeah.
sometimes even owning them, and yet turning a blind eye to the abuse.
So it's like a system almost set up for exploitation, even if that's not their stated goal.
Exactly.
Okay, and then scenario 5, This one kind of blew my mind.
Yeah.
It's about states funding modern slavery through their export credit agencies. I'll be honest, I'm drawing a blank on export credit agencies. What are those?
So think about them as government tools that are meant to promote international trade.
Okay.
So they'll give loans, insurance, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
to companies that are doing business overseas. The problem is they might end up supporting projects that actually rely on forced labor.
Wow. So the government's like indirectly funding slavery,
Exactly.
even if they don't realize it.
It really highlights how interconnected those global supply chains are.
Yeah.
Something as simple as buying a product could be unwittingly supporting forced labor across the world.
That's really unsettling.
It is.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But it sounds like the report offers some solutions as well.
It does. And they're not just vague ideas either.
Quite good.
They lay out a whole set of actionable recommendations
Oh,
for
good.
things that states can do to actually address these problems.
I'm ready for some good news. Let's hear it.
All right. We'll dive into that next time.
Yeah, this has been intense, to say the least, but incredibly important to understand.
I agree. It really forces you to think about the role of government in a whole new light.
It does.
And it forces you to think about your own role
Yeah,
as a consumer and as a citizen.
yeah.
Welcome back to the deep dive. I don't know about you, but I'm still processing all that information about how states can be complicit in modern slavery.
It's definitely a lot to take in.
It is. It's heavy stuff.
Hmm.
But the good news is the report doesn't just outline the problems.
Right.
It offers some potential solutions, too.
Absolutely. And that's what I think is so valuable about this report.
Yeah.
It doesn't just leave us with a sense of despair.
Yeah.
It empowers us to think about how we can actually address these issues.
Okay, good, because I was getting a little overwhelmed. Like, where do we even begin?
Well, the first thing to remember is that we already have many of the tools we need.
Okay.
The report emphasizes using existing international mechanisms
Right.
to tackle modern slavery. There's already a framework of laws and conventions in place.
So we got the laws on the books, but they're just not being enforced effectively. Yeah, in many cases, that's exactly right.
Okay.
Take the 1956 Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery.
Okay.
It specifically addresses practices that are similar to slavery,
Yeah.
but it needs more teeth. The report urges states to cooperate with each other
Right.
and with the UN to really give this convention the power it needs to make a difference.
Global cooperation. That makes sense. You can't solve a global problem without a global effort.
Exactly.
What else is already out there that we can build on?
Well, there's the International Labor Organization, the ILO.
Okay.
They have a number of conventions and complaint mechanisms
Okay.
that can be used to hold states accountable for labor exploitation.
So a worker who's being exploited could actually file a complaint with the ILO.
That's right. It gives them a way to seek justice, even if their own government isn't protecting them.
Okay, so we've got these international laws. We've got organizations like the ILO. But I have a feeling it's not as simple as just having the laws in place.
You're right. Governments are very good at finding loopholes.
That's cool.
So that's why the report goes beyond just relying on international law.
Okay.
It stresses the need to actually tackle corruption within governments themselves.
Which makes sense because a lot of those scenarios that we talked about hinged on corrupt officials
Exactly.
or agencies turning a blind eye.
That's right. So there are a number of concrete steps that the report calls for.
Okay.
Things like strengthening controls
Yeah.
to identify and punish corrupt officials,
Okay.
providing training to public officials on modern slavery
Oh.
so they can't plead ignorance,
Right.
and increasing transparency,
Yeah.
and things like government-to-government agreements on labor migration.
So shining a light on those processes so it's harder for shady deals to happen in the dark.
Exactly. It's like cleaning up your own house
Yeah.
before you start pointing fingers at other countries.
Right. It can't just be a top-down approach, though. We also have to think about the people who are actually being exploited right now.
Absolutely. And the report dedicates a whole section to that.
Okay.
It focuses on preventing vulnerability and ensuring that victims have a way out.
So what are some of those practical steps that can be taken to actually help the people who are trapped in these situations?
Well, one key area is visa requirements for overseas domestic workers.
Okay.
Right now, many of these workers are completely dependent on their employer for their visa status.
Right.
So if they speak out against abuse, they risk being deported.
Yeah, that's a horrible catch-22.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the report recommends revising visa requirements
Okay.
to give workers more control.
Yeah.
So things like the ability to change employers or apply for visa extensions without needing their employer's permission.
That makes a lot of sense. Giving them more agencies so they're not so dependent on an employer that might be exploiting them?
Right. It's about shifting that power dynamic.
Yeah.
Another recommendation focuses on human rights impact assessments.
Yeah.
Remember we talked about how passports are often confiscated
Yeah.
as a tactic to trap people in forced labor?
Right. It sounds way too easy.
Well, these impact assessments would actually require governments to consider the potential consequences of their policies
Okay.
on human rights before enacting them.
Oh, so being proactive about it.
Exactly.
Huh.
So, for example, any law relating to borders or passport control would have to be evaluated
Mm-hmm.
to ensure that it doesn't inadvertently create vulnerabilities to trafficking and exploitation.
It seems like common sense, but I bet it doesn't happen as often as it should.
You're probably right.
Yeah.
So another concrete measure that the report suggests is prohibiting recruitment fees outright in domestic law.
Okay.
Remember those exorbitant fees that we talked about
Yeah.
that trap workers in debt bondage?
Right.
Those need to go. And it also recommends much stricter control and inspection of employment agencies
Okay.
to ensure that they aren't taking advantage of workers.
So giving workers more agency and more protection throughout that whole migration process.
That's right. It's not just about cracking down on the bad guys. It's
Excellent.
about preventing the system itself
Yeah.
from being exploitative.
I like that. And it goes beyond just the migration process too, right?
Yeah, the report goes even further. It urges states to ensure that their legal systems and their judicial systems actually guarantee migrant workers access to justice.
So that means things like legal assistance and compensation for victims of exploitation.
Exactly. They need to have the means to actually pursue their claims.
Right.
And get this, it even suggests using something called extraterritorial jurisdiction
Okay.
to hold companies accountable
Yeah.
for labor exploitation that happens overseas.
Wait, break that down for me. Extraterritorial jurisdiction. What is that?
It's a powerful legal tool that allows a country to actually prosecute crimes that happen outside of its borders.
Okay.
So let's say you have a company that's based in the U.S.,
Uh-huh.
but they're using forced labor in their factories in another country.
Yeah.
The U.S. government could actually prosecute that company under U.S. law,
Wow.
even though the exploitation happened somewhere else.
So holding companies accountable for their entire supply chain no matter where it stretches?
Exactly. That
Yeah.
sends a clear message that that kind of exploitation won't be tolerated,
Yeah.
no matter where it occurs. But there's one more area we need to talk about, and it's a tricky one.
Okay.
Diplomatic immunity.
Right, because we talked about how that can be used as a shield for diplomats who are exploiting workers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It almost feels like an impossible problem to solve.
It does. What does the report say about that?
Well, it acknowledges the complexities, but it doesn't shy away from offering solutions.
Okay.
One suggestion is that states should be willing to waive immunity from jurisdiction
Okay.
for public officials when there are credible allegations
Yeah.
of involvement in modern slavery.
Yeah, so no more getting a free pass just because you're a diplomat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you're exploiting workers, you should be held accountable regardless of your diplomatic status.
I like that. And does it go further than that?
It does. It suggests a prospective waiver of immunity for employment-related disputes.
Okay.
If there's reason to believe that serious human rights violations have occurred, it also encourages states to cooperate with foreign courts that are investigating these cases,
Wow.
even when their own diplomats are involved.
Potentially holding their own diplomats accountable.
That's right. It's about prioritizing human rights
Yeah.
above diplomatic convenience. The report also encourages domestic courts to interpret those existing exceptions to immunity,
Right.
more broadly, particularly the commercial exception,
Yeah.
to cover cases of exploitation of domestic workers.
So really trying to close those loopholes that allow diplomats to get away with abuse.
Exactly. It's about being creative and committed to finding solutions.
But what happens when states just refuse to cooperate?
Yeah.
What if they just ignore all these recommendations?
Right.
Is there any way to actually force them to take action?
Well, the report suggests that states and international organizations should consider using sanctions
Okay.
or other forms of pressure on states that are either engaging in modern slavery
Yeah.
or turning a blind eye to it.
So we're talking like economic sanctions, travel bans, that sort of thing?
Exactly. Hitting them where it hurts.
Right.
So the threat of these consequences might be enough to motivate them to change their behavior.
So there's a whole range of tools in the toolbox, from diplomacy to legal action to economic pressure.
It's a multifaceted problem that requires a multifaceted approach.
It does. But I find it interesting that the report goes beyond those kind of like traditional diplomatic and legal tools,
Right.
and it highlights the role of public awareness and pressure in actually driving change.
That's right. Because it's not just about governments talking to each other
Yeah,
behind closed doors.
right.
It's about citizens getting involved, speaking out, and demanding action.
And that's where we, the listeners, come in, right?
Exactly.
It's easy to feel powerless when you're talking about these massive global issues like modern slavery.
Yeah.
But you're saying we shouldn't underestimate the power of individual action.
Absolutely not. Think of it this way. Every movement for social change
Right.
starts with individuals who care enough to speak up, to demand better.
Yeah.
And when those voices join together, they become a force that governments can't ignore.
So where do we even begin?
Hmm.
What are some things that listeners can do right now to make a difference?
Well, first and foremost, educate yourself.
Hmm.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
We'll link to the full report in the show notes.
Yeah.
Take some time to actually read through it. Go beyond the headlines.
Yeah.
Learn about the supply chains of the products that you buy.
Right.
Are companies using ethically sourced materials? Are they treating their workers fairly?
Yeah.
Support organizations that are working to combat modern slavery.
Right.
I mean, there's so many people out there that are doing incredible work,
Yeah.
and they need our support.
So it's about being a conscious consumer, doing your research, and putting your money where your values are.
Exactly.
What else? What else can we do?
Talk about it.
Okay.
Don't let modern slavery be this taboo subject.
Yeah.
Share what you've learned with your friends, your family, your colleagues. Post about it on social media. Write to your elected officials. The more we can bring this issue out in the open, the harder it will be for governments to ignore it.
It's like that saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant,
Right.
shining a light on these dark corners where exploitation thrives.
Exactly. And remember, change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
This is a long-term fight. There are going to be setbacks. There are going to be moments of frustration.
Yeah.
But don't give up hope.
Yeah.
Every action that you take, no matter how small it might seem, it contributes to a larger movement.
Yeah. You know, I think back to the beginning of this deep dive.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling so overwhelmed by just the sheer scale of this problem.
Right.
But now I'm feeling not exactly optimistic, but definitely empowered. Like, okay, this is a huge challenge, but there are things that we can do.
That's the spirit.
Yeah.
I think that's a great takeaway from this report.
Yeah.
This isn't just a dry academic exercise.
Right.
It's a call to action. It shows us the problem, but it also gives us this roadmap
Yeah.
for solutions. And it's up to all of us to take that roadmap and actually use it.
It's been a really insightful, at times challenging, deep dive into this really complex world of modern slavery.
It has.
And I think it's so important to understand how states can be complicit in this practice, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not.
Right.
But the good news is there are solutions.
There
There are things that we can do. We can demand better from our leaders.
Absolutely.
And hopefully work towards a future where this kind of exploitation just isn't possible anymore.
I think that's a future worth fighting for.
I agree. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
It's been a pleasure being here.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into modern slavery.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
And we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.